Okay, so we're now doing part 2 of sin, which is going to focus on social and structural sin and look at some contextual theologies which can help us understand this, I think, a little bit better. I really think this part's important because I grew up in a tradition where everything was hyper individualized, even communion. What does communion mean? It doesn't just mean communion with God. It means, I mean, the original setting of communion was a feast, right? Was dinner, was being together. And now it's in my church. I'm not trying to overly, well, yeah, I'm criticizing a little bit, but I think there's something that happens. What we do, the things that we do, the rituals that we do, reflect and affect our theology. And the way that we understand communion, well, first of all, it was just a memorial. I'll get back to that later. And we would take these individualized cups, think about all the sins that we'd committed that week. And when we felt that we had addressed all those individual sins, then I went ahead and took the cup. That is a very hyper individualized way of looking at sin, and not surprising given Western culture. Well, surprise, much of the world does not think about sin just in highly individualized ways like that. And I think that when we do, it makes it very difficult to understand horrible corporate sins like the Holocaust or the genocide in Rwanda and other things where we go, how could that possibly happen, right? Well, that's hopefully part of what we're going to explore in this section. How in the world can that happen? And there's a whole nother dimension to sin which we need to explore, which is what we call structural sin or corporate sin. That is when the very structures that we are in are themselves sinful. And so, on that note, I'm going to start with a quote from William Faulkner. Well, it's attributed to William Faulkner, may not be, but all of us labor in webs spun long before we were born. Webs of heredity and environment, of desire and consequence, of history and eternity. Haunted by wrong turns and roads not taken, we pursue images perceived as new, but whose providence dates to the dim dramas of childhood, which are themselves but ripples of consequence, echoing down the generations. Let me explain that a little bit. When we hyper-individualize sin, we do not understand how previous sins have come in and affected us, and how the sins that we commit create new ripples in the pond, which extend outwards for untold generations. This is my criticism of hyper-individualized Christianity. It is that we think that when I've committed a sin, and I think of it just as an offense against God, and I come before God, confess my sin, and hopefully He will. I believe He forgives me. The consequence of that sin is not necessarily erased. If someone has been sexually abused, how many times have we read that the person who has committed the abuse was himself or herself sexually abused before then? How far back does that go? And how have we now, that person now created by abusing this child, created a likelihood that this child is more open to distortions in that child's personhood, which will affect her, the relationships that she's in, her own children, his own children, that will then affect their children, and on and on and on. So that sin isn't something that happens in a vacuum and gets erased, but that we understand the gravity of sin, that sin has consequences, and though God may forgive us, those consequences ripple throughout time. And the good news is hopefully the good things that you do and the things that you do which reflect the goodness of God, in which you incarnate the presence of Christ in the world, hopefully, and I believe, also ripple and have consequences throughout. And that's why it's so important, not just what we have been saved from, but what we've been saved for, and the things that we do, not just the things that we don't do. Okay, so let's go on from there. All right. We are this is another quote from, I think it's Reagan's America. Yep, it is. We are hostages to each other in a deadly interrelatedness. There is no clean slate of nature unscribbled on by all one's forebearers. This is connected to the previous quote by Faulkner because it's saying something that I think is similar in a little bit different way, which is we aren't born in a vacuum with a nice clean slate. And we're going to talk about original sin in a slightly different way today. Not in the way necessarily that Augustine thought of it as through procreation, but that he may not have been completely wrong about original sin in the sense that we are not born in a clean slate. I am born into a particular family, into a particular history, into a particular culture, into a particular everything. And all of that has been conditioned by previous things that have happened. So there's no clean slate. The reality is that I am profoundly connected to what has gone on before and to those who are around me. And this goes back to what I was trying to explain in theological anthropology, that we are profoundly relational people, that we become through our relations with others. This seems to be the way that God has created us, that we have that center post, which is our relationship with God, that runs through our being, but that we are levels of sedimentation of relation, that every interaction that we have with another human being contributes to that person's personhood as they contribute to ours. And it may just be a moment in time, it may be a life profound changing something that happens, but that we become through the process of our relations with one another, that we are not static beings, and that we each contribute to each other's personhood. So remember, going back to what I said before, that to what degree would you be who you are if you had been born on a desert island and never met another human being, right? But that also means that every human that you interact with has been affected by countless things that have happened in that past that go back and back and back and back. So this interrelatedness is profound. It's what contributes to the persons that we are persons in becoming, right? We are persons that are becoming through our relations. But I also, let's see what I wanted to say here. And oh, by the way, something that I don't know that I mentioned about creation in the creation lecture is that creation also contributes to our personhood. You know, and I have a dog who has been a profound, I keep using that word, I'm so sorry, it's because it's at the front of my mind, source of healing for me after my husband's death. So even the creation itself can contribute to our personhood. And so anyway, enough said about that. That's an important part of creation, understanding creation theology, I think, as well. And I don't know that I noted it in the creation lectures. So let me go on then and pick up the thought of a particular theologian named Alistair McFadden, because I think he makes one of the most important contributions to this understanding of social sin, apart from liberation theology and so forth. And what he does is he reframes Augustine's notion of original sin, not as procreation, but as understanding that we do not come as babies born in a vacuum into a clean slate. And so let me start at the beginning. So one of the things that he says is that our current culture basically doesn't talk about God and it doesn't talk about sin. And from a secular perspective, even though there may be people who believe in those things, in terms of the way that we engage in the secular world, it's characterized by a pragmatic form of atheism. That is, that there's this idea that we don't need to have God in order to mediate our understanding and practice. No need for God talk, therefore no need for sin talk. But his point that he's going to make is it is exactly at this point of God and understanding the profound, oh gosh, I am so sorry. I'm not going to use that word anymore. This relationality that is constitutive of our being, that is going to contribute to our understanding of sin, even for people that are not Christians. Okay? So the framework that I'm going to give you now means more because it is a theological understanding. But it is a theological understanding that can contribute to the secular understanding of sin. And you'll see what I mean by that in a second. Now, our culture has largely rejected original sin. Even among Christians, original sin had kind of fallen out of favor amongst many Christians. But certainly the larger culture doesn't believe in original sin. What the larger culture wants to believe is that every decision that I make in a clean way. So that, let's say, I'm confronted with the possibility of, I'm trying to think of a particular sin that's coming to mind, of saying something bad about my mother to somebody. And what they're saying is that when I come to that place and I'm going to make that decision to harm somebody, to speak badly about somebody, I come to that decision almost like a clean slate. And that every single time I come to that place, I have the ability to choose the right or the wrong thing to do. That's what our culture would have us believe. And that is the insight that Augustine had that is so important. And if perhaps his formulation may not be quite right, the idea is quite right, which is, no, we actually don't come with this clean slate, so that when I make the decision to sin or not, I come with that with this freedom to make the right decision every time. And that, what original sin tells us is that we don't come with full freedom to make the right decisions every time. That we're already, something comes before the actual decision to sin, which affects the very decision that we make. That's what's going to be reformulated by Alistair McFadden. So contemporary culture likes to say that we have this complete freedom to always choose the wrong or the right thing, and that is not the case. We don't live in that kind of absolute freedom, and this model is going to show you why that's the case. Since original sin posits that sin is ontologically part of our nature, this has been problematic for culture because it seems to infringe on the notion of our freedom to choose. Of course, we're going to reject original sin. I like the idea, rather, that I live in this complete freedom, and that every time I do something, I'm operating in this wonderful bubble of freedom to be able to choose. Now, I want you to understand, this has huge impact in understanding our prison system, our justice system, and don't get me wrong, I'm not like you don't have to be. This is about liberal and conservative. This is just about trying to understand human nature and what actually happens when we do bad things. And why is it that a nation that looked like it was a nation of good people, one of the most quote unquote civilized nations in the world like Germany, could end up doing such a gross, systematic genocide of millions of people, and that extends not just the Jews, but the handicapped, the people that were rejects of society, homosexuals, anyone who didn't fit in with the narrative of what a perfect, pure German looked like. All right. So let's go. We're going to return to that. So this is what McFadden does. He reinterprets this idea of original sin. He doesn't accept the idea of biological transmission, but he believes that our sin is transmitted through social means. And I'm going to quote it and unpack it for you. What we inherit are the consequences of a past history of freedom as they distort the conditions of communication of relation, and thereby of meaning, value, and identity formation in which we are situated. Remember how I said our personhood is constituted by relation? That we're profoundly interrelated and I use that word again. Interconnected, that's my word for the day that won't go away. We inherit this furthermore not merely as the external situation upon which we act, but it is the internal precondition through of our free agency. Sin is then propagated through forms of sociality. It's actually socially distorted through a history of sinning. The social processes, structures, and institutions through which we are called into full personhood, the very processes through which we receive the conditions for autonomous and therefore responsible action, are pathologically distorted. They are alienated and alienating from God. What is he saying? He says, basically, before we even act, we are already have been shaped and touched by actions other people have taken, including actions and other sins people have done, which end up becoming a precondition in our own becoming, in the way that we are and therefore already, we're not born into a vacuum. We're already born into a family, a culture, a world which has been shaped by acts of will that have preceded us, and many of those acts have been sinful acts that have led to the place where they are today. And that's what we're born into. We're not born into a clean slate. And what we don't realize is that we inherit many of those ways of thinking, many of those ways of being. We inherit, we're breathing those in without even realizing it. It's in the ether that's around, it's in the ether, it's in the air. We're just breathing it in. We're not aware of it. We're just breathing it in, and it becomes the environment in which we operate. And that environment is not a clean slate. It's not a slate of perfect freedom, because we're not operating in a place of perfect freedom. We're operating in a place in which other people have acted that have already distorted the space in which we do our own willing and acting. All right? Let's just take this down to a more personal level. No family is perfect, right? I'm sure that you can go back in your own family and think there's many amazing, wonderful things, maybe for some of you less wonderful. But for those less wonderful things, those didn't pop up in a vacuum. Those very things which were not good things had already been shaped how many generations back by other people's actions that shaped the next generation, which shaped the next generation, that then shaped the environment in which you are growing and becoming, right? So, we spend a lot of our lives rejecting some of the things that we grew up with and adopting other things. But the problem is sometimes those things are so much part of the air that we're breathing, we can't even recognize them anymore. But all of that is to say, our culture wants to say we act in perfect freedom, but the fact is that we don't act in perfect freedom because we're not operating from a blank slate. All right, let me see if I can unpack that a little bit more as we continue. So what McFadden is doing is he's holding together the idea that we have the freedom of will to sin, with the idea that freedom is reliant upon context, including previous acts of willing exercised by others. So again, not a clean slate, but we're already operating in a space in which other people have already acted in that environment, right? So we do not experience freedom then in the great sense which our culture wants to tell us that we do. We have some freedom, but not this great freedom. So what does this mean then for, let's say, someone who's born in an inner city situation and all he knows or she knows are gang violence and that environment, and that's what they become a part of, and then they end up going to prison, that becomes perpetuated. Were they ever free to choose the right thing as someone else in a different environment might have had the freedom to choose? Did other people's choosing, which now has them in an environment, already has put a constraint on their own ability to make the right choices? I want to make a note of something. Okay, I'm just going to put this here to remind me that I have something to say. Okay. All right. So McFadden talks about sin as colonizing our will, and by doing so warps the field in which the will is exercised. So while we are free, quote unquote, to choose our actions, our choices are inherently distorted by prior acts of willing and action. So we're free in some sense, but we're also bound to sin. So what sin does is he talks about this as colonizing our will. That is, that sin actually affects our ability to make the choices the right choices we need to make. Then we make choices that affects other people's ability to make the right choices, and on. So the reality is the field in which we are trying to exercise our willing is a warped field that has already come into play by previous actions of willing and choices of others. Now, sin then he also sees as a relational pathology, broken relation between God and us. That's pretty evident for most of you. And he sees that as acting, what we do have then is an active misrelation to God as we worship other forces and realities. So what's the solution to this is reorientation in our relation to God. So we're going to return to this. So although our attempts are distorted by sin, we can face sin only through grace, which empowers us to genuine worship. So a couple of things to note there is it's a relational pathology. So sin isn't something which is understood in the abstract. Sin is first and foremost something which is relational in nature. Now, I'm going to say something that McFadden does not say. It's actually something Jürgen Moltmann says, which I think is really important as we continue this discussion. If we understand sin the way that McFadden is trying to help us understand it, we realize we're not as free as we think, and that we are operating in a field of preconditions that restrict our own freedom to choose rightly. Then how can we have freedom? And it brings new power to the words, "In Christ we are free indeed." Because there's this idea that Jürgen Moltmann has, and I'm just going to join it with McFadden's here, where Moltmann talks about how when the Christ event breaks open our future. So what happens is that, let's apply that here, like that we live in these kinds of closed systems, right? But when Jesus comes into the world, there were only so many possibilities that we could have because of all these preconditions that exist, right? This is Moltmann's idea. And if preconditions are understood a little differently than McFadden, but the idea is that our system is in some sense, conditioned by previous things that have happened, and that there's certain trajectories that and certain possibilities that exist within that, right? But when Christ comes in, he's not part of our system. So that when he comes in, he brings something genuinely new to this system, and he breaks it in. He comes in, and when he does so, he brings something new, and in bringing up that newness, he breaks open our future by creating possibilities that weren't possible before. And when I take that idea of Moltmann's and I marry it with this problem of sin in McFadden, that I think is a very important insight, then we see what freedom really means in Christ, because he creates possibilities that simply couldn't exist unless he came into that space. So where does freedom lie? Where we're no longer trapped by these systems, But when we open up ourselves to God's work in us, He is able to effect something truly new and to give us freedom in a deep sense. So I'm going to continue with McFadden because we're going to now explore very specific ways in which we see how this works out. But we're not left with that. And we're going to return to that, return to this idea in just a little bit. But I wanted to touch on this idea since we're talking about McFadden's thoughts on reorientation and worship, how that's going to work into what's the solution then. And if, we talk about Jesus dying on the cross, but what is that really affecting in terms of the sin that we find ourselves in now, right? That seems like, what is it that Paul says? I'm a prisoner, right? I want to do the things that I want to, but I can't do the things that I want to do. And who's going to save me from this? And then he talks about Christ, right? So hold on to that thought. Now, so in McFadden's view then, sin is a condition that lies behind our personal action. So you contrast this with modern moral discourse that wants to say that we're only accountable for our free acts, right? And that's why people go to jail. They commit a free act and they go to jail, right? But then sometimes the court will take into account, well, look at where they came from, look at what happened, And part of that is, how do we understand the situation in which the person found themselves? Because we realize that sometimes our acts are affected by the context in which we find ourselves. So what he also explores is, and which is important, is that he doesn't, and I'm not going to get into this so much because it's going to be hard to understand and you're going to misunderstand it very easily, but he talks about the relationship between perpetrators and victims and how they can each end up contributing to this warped field of willing in which we find ourselves. So, and he uses in his book specifically two examples: child sexual abuse and the Holocaust. And I'm not going to go over the whole thing, except to say, when we look at the Holocaust and we ask the question, how is it that, I had a friend of mine who was a World War II vet, and he was with the Liberating Army at Dachau. And the little city of Dachau is not far away from the concentration camp. It's several miles out. And when the soldiers went into shock when they saw what they saw at Dachau, and when they were very angry, and when they went into the city, they were saying to the residents, "How could you have let this happen?" And they said, "Oh, we didn't know." And my teacher said, the teacher who became my friend, he said, "How could you not smell it?" And the idea is that even if these people were not pushing the button at the gas chamber, they were complicit in the sin in their non-action. So they participated in the sin through other actions which enabled that concentration camp to exist and ultimately allowed for people to push that button to exterminate thousands of people. So, and the reason they were able to do this, and I just don't have the time to go into it. If we had this class live, I'd go into more detail as to how this happened. And he talks about how, when the ability of Hitler to remove people from that final act of the final solution of pushing the button, but to still have the entire nation in some way contributing to it through its actions, either through not saying anything, being complicit in it, through non-action, through actions that supported the system, but they couldn't see how their actions actually contributed to that final button push. Let's take, for example, and Hitler did that and his people did that largely through separating and creating so many steps in between that people could not connect their action here with the final result over here. So even the man who's taking down the names of the Jews as they're getting onto the train, and maybe may or may not know what's going to happen to those Jews at the other end of the line, is contributing to the sin that is occurring there, even if he doesn't know it. He is enabling the system to exist, which is going to allow for this great atrocity to occur. Okay, so let's see. You can kind of look at that example of the Holocaust. I'm not going to go, and the next one down. And you can just read it and just meditate on the words. Just think about what's actually being said here. You have to reread several of the sentences over and over again. You don't have to memorize the thoughts about the Holocaust, but I do expect you to understand how we are not as free as we think we are. And so we are already born into a preconditioned state that affects the way that we make the decisions that we do, which can lead to sin, to sinful decisions, okay? Even if we're unaware of them. All right. So let me get to the problem and the solution. Sin is the energized resistance to the dynamics of God, thereby as constriction in the fullness of being in communion and joy. Go back to the theological anthropology section. Sin is thus construed primarily in dynamic terms as highly energized, comprehensive distortion in, through, and of all relationships. It is clear that this disorientation is transmitted through the dynamics of social relationships. These include those through which we construct our personhood, our identity, life intentionality, and the sense of what is good, right, and true. So even what we think is good, right, and true has already been shaped before we ever start engaging with those ideas of what is good, right, and true. The environment has already been shaped by those things. So when we had slavery in the United States, and you can have forms of racism now, anyway, whatever it is that's happening, I'm just going to go back to slavery. It is part of a system in which people have identified certain things as a good which aren't a good, and then you're born into that system unless something comes from the outside that lets you know, or you believe that there's something innate which is going to speak against that system. It's very hard to fight something that you're born into because it's part of the air that you breathe, right? So, and we're going to look at that a little bit more, but I think I've hammered the point enough, right? That we are not as free as we think we are. Now, if there's a problem, here's the solution. And he presents, this is a solution, worship. What is worship but a reorientation towards God, right? A proper reorientation towards God, which in doing that empowers us, and which grace is active in that reorientation. And that's where I really want to pull back in Moltmann's understanding that I brought in, that we may not have the ability that we may be somewhat constricted in the environment that we're in, but when we open up ourselves to God's grace through proper orientation towards God in worship, that Christ enters into that space, breaks into that space, and blows open the future and creates new possibilities. And that includes new freedom and new possibilities of willing in that. And that's part of the empowerment of the Holy Spirit. Okay, that I added to Alistair McFadden. Okay, Alistair McFadden does not talk about Moltmann or all those things. I'm just joining some ideas together with Alistair McFadden's. Going back to McFadden, identity is not formed as an independent exercising of the will, but in relationship to God and others. So there's an intentionality there that we should be aware of. And so we need to reorient ourselves to a life in communion with God and with others. And the Christian community should be the place as the light on the hill in which where sinful paradigms are reworked and our worship is properly redirected. So, I have just a small critique of all that because there's a lot that I agree with in McFadden, which is why I bring him into this discussion. I believe that the solution of worship as reorientation needs to be combined with an understanding of participation in Christ. So it's not just that we reorient ourselves, but if we combine that with the Eastern Orthodox idea of theosis, and that we allow ourselves, we consciously, we embrace and allow ourselves to be pulled in to and participate in Christ's nature, we are transformed into the image of Christ and brought deeper into that life of God. And that is also a solution to, I think, this problem of social sin and structural sin. I'm just going to say a few more words because there are several contextual approaches to sin that I think are helpful in this, and I like to bring in ideas not just from the Western perspective but from other perspectives as well. So it is actually other outside theologies outside of the West that have probably done the most in terms of contributing to this consciousness of the social dimensions of sin. And there are what we call liberation theologies, and those liberation theologies, there's Latin American liberation theology, there's Black theology of liberation, there's even some feminist theologies could be considered that, but there's African theologies, Asian theologies. But in terms of liberation theologies, one of the common elements of liberation theology is to recognize that sin is not simply something I do, it's something that we can do, that sometimes that we do, and that things don't happen in isolation. An entire structure, entire system can be sinful, right? And if you think about it, that's very biblical. Think about Israel as a corporate body, and how God continually sent prophetic voices which spoke the will of God and reoriented them back to God, because they were oppressing the poor, they were not taking care of the widows, they were serving other gods, all these things, and the prophets speak to those things and help Israel reorient itself properly to God, and sometimes not. I mean, we lose the bottom 10 tribes, right? So, I mean, the lower half of Israel, the 10, let me just go on. Anyway, liberation theologies have really caught on to that, and while a sin is largely looked at from a Western perspective in terms of Genesis 1 through 3, liberation theologies tend to look more at Exodus and sin from the perspective of Exodus rather than Genesis, if that makes any sense, especially Exodus 1 through 3, where we see systems that are oppressive and that God speaks to those systems, all right? And God wants to liberate people from those systems of oppression. So let's take a quote from James Combs, who's kind of considered the father of Black theology. Sin is not primarily a religious impurity, but rather it is the social, political, and economic oppression of the poor. It is the denial of the humanity of the neighbor through unjust political and economic arrangements. You don't have to agree with this, but let's, in its fullness, some of you may, but is there an element to this which speaks to that corporate or nature of sin, right? So, I mentioned several different approaches. So you have liberation theology, which rejects the privatization of sin and talks about the social and economic dimensions of sin. You have thinkers like liberation theologians like Gustavo Gutierrez, who's very much influenced the Catholic Church as a whole, because he's a Catholic theologian. He and other Catholic theologians have helped the Catholic Church be much more sensitive to oppressive structures, and the current Pope is especially sensitive, having grown up in an environment like that. He understands how structures can be oppressive. So we have to look not only at individual sin, but look at whatever social heritage may predispose people to certain types of sin. So that's the problem. Like I said, if you're born into a place where slavery is okay, there's a predisposition now as part of the culture to the sin of slavery, right? So liberation theology tries to make us aware of the heritage that we have, that different cultures have, which may mean that we have, as a culture, predispositions to certain kinds of sin. Okay? All right. So sin has has corporate and structural embodiments in which injustice, oppression, and exploitation end up becoming institutionalized. And so you need those voices to address that. And there's all kinds of other parts of liberation theology, such as things like a belief in God's preferential option for the poor and oppressed, and so forth. I don't really want to get into that so much. I simply want to say that how it is that they're understanding sin and their contribution they make to the discussion. Then you have feminist theologians, and one of the things, I'm just going to take one aspect that they might bring in terms of a contribution to sin. And they talk, one of the things might be, are there certain sins that a gender is predisposed towards? And what's important about that is that if we don't understand that there may be certain predispositions to certain kinds of sin of men and women, then we may actually, let's say that some of you are therapists, you may address, even if you're not addressing religion directly, you may think, okay, this person is struggling with XYZ, but let's say, I know some of you are therapists, so you are very much aware, I think, that when a woman has been abused, you want to be very careful to not re-abuse the person by piling on additional guilt or additional things that have to do with the specific form of abuse that they've incurred. And that's one of the things that feminist theologians talk about in regards to sin. That if you want to say, for example, the big sin is pride, like Luther said, well, that may be a man's great sin. But for most women, and for many women up until fairly recently, perhaps their greater sin was not pride, but self-abnegation, which leads to a lack of responsibility. And that is a sin that a particular gender and a particular culture may be more predisposed towards. So we have to think that even gender may predispose us to certain kinds of sin. So they talk about male theologians focus on sins involving pride and self-assertiveness towards God, especially in the Reformation understanding, while women may have their own tendencies towards other kinds of sin. So then if you are counseling someone, and I mean informally, let's say you're a good friend, but you're dealing with someone who was just badly hurt, like a woman, and you start talking about pride, you may actually be doing something which is destructive and not constructive, because the problem is not pride, the problem is probably excessive humility. Or if you counsel humility and obedience, that's actually not the problem. That has exacerbated the abuse that person has suffered. Sorry, I was reading too quickly there. Okay, our Black womanist theologians have highlighted that social location, that includes race and class, are significant, as well as gender. I'm going to look at one outside the West situation. It's actually none of these theologies. It's not liberation theology. It's not anything. We're just going to look at another context and see why it is that when we are too restrictive about our understanding of sin, sin has a number of dimensions, and that's what we've been trying to explore in this class. It's not a single thing. It's multifaceted, as the atonement is also multifaceted. So whatever you think the problem is, the solution is going to be related to the problem. But there may not be just one problem. There may be a multitude of things that are going on here, and Jesus's the Christ event addresses the multitude of things that are the problem over here. Okay, so it's not a single faceted thing. So when we think of it in particular ways, and we are exclusive or reductive, I should say, reductive in our way of thinking about sin, it actually may not be helpful, because that might not be the kind of sin or even the understanding of sin that exists in other cultures. For example, there are many cultures in Asia, Africa, certain parts of the Middle East, which are shame-honor cultures. And so sin is related to the shame-honor culture, which has a very strong corporate dimension, rather to this like individualized notion of sin as a sin against the law of God, which gets a penalty, and Jesus addresses the penalty for us. That's not going to mean much to a culture that sees sin not in juridical terms, but in societal and relational terms, and like shame, honor. Okay? So let's take a closer look specifically at Africa through Margaret Schuster's work, all right? Or Dr. Schuster's work. And again, Africa is not one nation. Africa is many different nations. So you've got to understand that there's a diversity in Africa as well. So we're just going to pick up on a couple main ideas which are found in certain areas of Africa. We're just going to realizing at the same time that we're not looking at a homogeneous whole when we look at Africa. So typically, from the African perspective, humans are not inherently sinful. But they are sinful when they act in such a way that disrupts the harmony of the community. So it's not about there's no idea of original or inherited sin or sinful nature. That doesn't exist. In fact, there's actually more the concept that we're born with a pure soul, but we can still act in ways so anyway, that's not important. Just to say there's no original sin in the way that we're talking about it in the West. Rather, there are two aspects of sin. Well, let's take specifically the nation of Ghana, okay, because that's what she's looking at right here. Is in Ghana there are two aspects of sin, what they call wrongdoing and taboo. Wrongdoing even wrongdoing has two aspects. One of those aspects can be wrongdoing or evils that can include things like selfishness or murder or deception or whatever. And that can be between individuals. So I commit some kind of sin against you. But they have another word for sin that affects the entire community and in some sense pollutes that community through the actions that someone takes. All right, and I'm going to return to that in just a second. And then the other, so I talked about two aspects of sin, wrongdoing and taboo. And under wrongdoing, you can have individual wrongdoing, but you can also have a wrongdoing which affects the community as a whole, okay? Now, what is taboo? Taboo is doing those things which are forbidden acts. And they include often societal acts that are forbidden. And here's the thing. When you do things that are taboo, it doesn't just affect you. The idea is that it affects the entire community. And for that community, the community is not just in terms of the community that's there, that even includes ancestors, that is what they call the living dead, that are still understood to be among them. It affects everything. It even has a cosmic level of significance when we do things that are sinful or evil. So they understand that corporate nature in a way that sometimes can be forgotten in the West. And now what's interesting about sin is it's not understood primarily in theological terms as a sin or offense against God, but it's understood largely in societal terms, that it causes some disruption of societal harmony, which includes a cosmic level to it, right? So it's not, it's about it takes into account that profound interconnectedness that we have. Okay, so So it's not so much about breaking laws, breaking God's law, but it's about breaking the laws of society. Okay, so what does sin do? Then what sin does is it disrupts the social order, and because it's disrupting the social order, the implications are also social, right? And therefore goes beyond the parties that are specifically involved. So now I said that part of that means that there can be a kind of pollution that happens to that community as a result of those actions, whether it's incest or dishonoring the elders, dishonoring your parents, dishonoring the living dead, the ancestors. Whatever you're doing, that has implications that extend far beyond your specific actions to specific persons. So, so sin doesn't affect just the person; it affects the family and it affects the extended community. So, how is then sin addressed? Well, sin would be addressed then through ritual acts of purification, and that will cleanse the evil from the community. And from the pollution which has resulted from the evil acts that have been undertaken. Okay? So I suppose what I really want to point at is, in the States, for example, a few years ago, there were, I read in the paper several times over the course of a year, honor killings, people who were immigrants from other countries, whether India or from the Middle East, that had come in and their daughter, usually their daughter, had dishonored them in some way, had run away with a man, had done something, and the only way to bring honor back to the family was to kill that person, even if it was their own child or their own brother or their own sister, and to bring back the honor to the family. Why? Because an action is not just an action of the one that affects the one, it is an action that has a ripple effect that goes out into the family and goes out into the community. All right? When we we don't study Hinduism in this class, but if we did, you would have a better understanding of what I'm talking about. So let me see here. So I'm not going away. I'm just going to quickly just leave with a few words about this. Let me make sure I got everything I wanted to say. All right. So I only presented that to you, that example, to say, when you're dealing with a culture like that and you come in talking about juridical concepts of privatized sin, that's not going to make a lot of sense to those cultures. And that there are other aspects of sin, because sin has many dimensions, and the atonement of Jesus has many dimensions, right? And one may be more productive in a particular context than others, even though we have to hold the whole prism together, right? And not just focus on the one, but understand the totality of what sin is and understand the totality of what atonement means and Christ's actions mean in becoming incarnate for us, including life, death, resurrection, ascension. Okay, on that note, I'm just going to leave you with just a few words towards an evangelical theology. And the first is that I think, starting from the back to the front, that while it's important for us to consider sin at an individual level, this kind of understanding of social sin is a helpful contribution that helps to round out and balance an evangelical understanding of sin, and to understand that and anyway, that's all I want to leave with that. Secondly, that sin may be directed towards God, but that whether or not when God forgives us, we have to understand that when we commit sin, it often has a horizontal dimension as well as a vertical dimension that affects others and not just God. And that the one step may indeed be the first step, be to look for forgiveness from God. But if you want to address that ripple effect of the consequences of the actions that we've taken, we have to go back to the people against whom we've sinned. And, that's clear. Remember, if you've sinned against your brother, before you take communion, you go back and try to make that right. That's what Paul says, right? Because that horizontal dimension is our sin doesn't go this way. Our sin goes this way too. And God has told us that we need to address this dimension even as we address this dimension. And an understanding that sin works against God's ultimate intention for his creation, which is to form a community that is characterized by shalom. Okay? It is helpful to understand that sin is both a personal act that we do, but it is also a disposition that we have. Whether you want to completely adopt Augustine or Calvin's understanding of original sin or Luther's, or whether you look at it in a modified form like Alistair McFadden's, there is something that disposes us to that is a disposition that we have that we are working with when we sin. So again, that we're not operating from a clean slate. And so if we speak of sin only as an act, then we'll end up with a very superficial understanding of sin. So in the secular world, sin is just the act that we commit. And I think that leads to a whole host of problems, including, like I said, problems that end up affecting our justice system, rather than a deeper understanding that understands that there's a disposition that is present as well. On the other hand, we have to be careful not to overemphasize the disposition that we exclude the idea that we also freely commit acts, even if we're not as free as we think. They're in the freedom that we do have, we sometimes do sinful actions, right? So, and as I mentioned before, sin is both personal and communal. And so we're called to address injustice, oppression, and so forth. And that we may not realize it, but to develop our awareness of our own complicity in communal sins and address that and address their collective influence that they have. All right, we talked about structural sin. I'm just going to leave that there. And that we have a responsibility for the sin that we commit. So, everybody commits sins, but that doesn't absolve us of the fact that we're responsible for the sins that we commit. And lastly, I just want to reiterate, you're going to find out my prejudice is that I do not agree with Luther. I agree with the majority of the church in the world that says that the image of God was not destroyed, and that even though sin may affect all the aspects of someone's personhood, that there is still something there, and no one is beyond the possibility of redemption. And as defaced as that image may be, that God's grace is never limited. Okay, until next time.